My son grabbed my wrist so tight it hurt. I looked down at his hand, small, shaking, fingers pressed into my skin like he was trying to hold something in place. And for a second, I thought he was about to cry. But he didn't. He just leaned closer and said it quietly, like the words themselves were dangerous. "Mom, can we please not go home tonight? Just one night. I heard Dad planning something bad for us." I stared at him, not understanding, not yet. And that was the moment I should have listened. "My name is Avenel Lattimore, and I want to tell you about the morning I nearly lost everything, including my life, without knowing I was losing it." The clock above the microwave read 5:47 when I started packing his bag. Not because Warwick asked me to. He never asked. I just learned somewhere in the middle of our 8 years together that doing things myself was faster than waiting for a man who moved through this house like a guest who had never quite unpacked. The kitchen light above the stove was the only one on. The coffee was already brewing. 2 sugars, no cream. The way he liked it. The way I had made it, without thinking for so long that my hands did it before my mind arrived. I had been married to Warwick Pickens for 8 years. We had a son, Cassius, 10 years old, adopted, the best decision I ever made, and a home, and a life that looked from the outside exactly the way Warwick needed it to look. Solid, faithful, together. That Tuesday morning, it all still looked that way. Cassius came downstairs at 6:15. I heard him before I saw him. That soft, careful rhythm of his feet that meant he was awake but not ready. He sat at the table, wrapped both hands around his orange juice, and said nothing. I noted it. Filed it under tired. Did not press. Warwick came down at 6:30, already dressed, already on. He kissed my forehead. He smelled like the cologne I bought him 2 Christmases ago. He turned to Cassius and asked something about a school project, in the tone of a man performing a role he had not rehearsed enough. Cassius answered in one word. Warwick did not notice. Or he did, and moved past it. After 8 years, I still could not tell which. If you are watching this and you know exactly what I mean by that, drop your location in the comments. I want to know where my people are today. We loaded the car at 6:50. Warwick kept the conversation light on the drive. A work story I did not track. Something about the weather. A church event next month. I made sounds of agreement. I was thinking about dry cleaning. At the departure entrance, he checked his bags and turned to hold me. Same duration as always. Not longer. I watched him disappear through the glass doors and felt nothing particular. On the drive back, I passed the pharmacy where I collected my prescription every 3rd Thursday. The sight of it nudged something loose. A dinner table 8 years ago. Me telling Warwick plainly that I could not carry a pregnancy. Ever. His face. The long moment before the sincerity settled into it. A half second I had noticed and filed away and never once reopened. I left it closed and kept driving. 12 minutes from the airport, Cassius said my name. Very quietly. He was looking straight ahead. His voice was careful. The way a child speaks when they have been rehearsing something. "Mom, can we please stay away from home tonight? Just one night. I heard Dad planning something bad for us." I almost smiled. I thought it was anxiety. I thought the tension in our house had finally found a shape inside him that was too big to hold quietly. I asked him what he meant. He told me in pieces, "Tomorrow night, make sure nobody is inside first." And his own name said in a way he could not fully explain. Something shifted in my chest that I could not name. I told him we would go to his grandmother's. I said it like a treat. He looked back out the window. His hands were folded tight in his lap. I turned the radio up. I told myself he was 10 years old. I almost convinced myself. I would talk to him about it properly tomorrow. Tomorrow. Cassius fell asleep on my mother's couch at 8:13. I know the exact time because I was watching him. The way his breathing slowed, the way his grip on the throw pillow loosened. And I remember thinking that a child who falls asleep that quickly in a strange place is either completely safe or completely exhausted. With Cassius, it was always both. I sat across the room and let my mind go somewhere I had not visited in a while. The first time I truly saw Warwick Pickens was at a church conference 7 years before that night. He was on a young professionals panel and he asked a question so sharp the entire room turned toward him. Not loud, not aggressive, just precise enough that people leaned in without realizing they had. I remember watching him from the second row, noticing how still he was, how deliberate. I remember thinking, that man pays attention. I was half right. Warwick paid attention to everything that was useful to him. Everything else he let pass without a second glance. He pursued me with what felt like devotion. Looking back, I understand it was strategy, consistent, patient, precisely calibrated. There was a rhythm to it, a call at the right time, a visit that never overstayed. Small things, remembered and repeated back at you in a way that makes you feel seen. He charmed my mother, Odessa, in a way that still embarrasses me now, remembered her birthday, brought the right things when he visited, asked about her health in a tone that made her pause before answering. She told me once, that man knows how to show up. She meant it as a compliment. She was not wrong about the showing up. She was wrong about why. Before the wedding, I sat across from him at dinner and told him the truth. I could not carry a pregnancy. Had known since I was 23. Premature ovarian insufficiency. The doctor had been kind but direct, and I had learned to be the same. I told Warwick he deserved to know before we made anything permanent. He did not answer immediately. He picked up his glass, set it back down, looked at me for a long moment. Then he said it did not matter. Said it while holding eye contact, steady and warm. And I had spent my whole life learning to read sincerity in people's faces. I misread his completely. What I did not see, what I registered for half a second, and then dismissed, was not grief, not acceptance. It was calculation, the quiet, unhurried kind. He had just received a piece of information, and he was already deciding what to do with it. He would spend the next several years figuring that out. The first year of marriage felt like partnership. The second felt like management. By the third, I had developed small adjustments I never named. Conversations I steered away from. Moods I worked around. Silences I filled before they could grow into something worse. Once, about 2 years in, I asked him directly if something was wrong. Nothing, he said. You think too much. He smiled when he said it. I apologized. That was how those moments ended. I told myself all marriages required navigation. I was not wrong about that. I was wrong about what I was navigating around. Warwick grew up in a household where reputation was the closest thing to scripture. His father a deacon, his mother running women's ministry for 14 years. He learned early that if you were seen doing the right things consistently enough, nobody looked too closely at what was actually happening. He did not practice goodness. He performed it. There is a distance between those two things wide enough to hide a body. When I pushed for the adoption, he agreed because refusing required an explanation that would have exposed him. A man who would not adopt a child in need when his wife could not conceive. In our community, that man had something wrong with him. Warwick could not afford that. So he signed the papers, shook the caseworker's hand, and performed fatherhood exactly as well as he performed everything else. Convincingly enough to pass. Never warmly enough to mean anything. 14 months before the fire, he took out a life insurance policy on me through a broker outside our usual network. Quietly, carefully. The premiums were small enough to disappear inside the monthly bills. Around the same time, he began a relationship with a woman 3 hours away. He told her my marriage was emotionally dead, that I had never wanted children. He told her this while I was filling out Cassius's adoption paperwork. I knew none of it sitting in that room watching my son sleep. My phone buzzed on the cushion beside me. A text from Warwick. Landed safe. Miss you already. I looked at the message for a moment longer than I needed to. Then I smiled, put the phone face down, closed my eyes. I found him at the kitchen table before I found my own footing that morning. Cassius was already sitting there when I came downstairs, notebook open, pencil moving, completely inside whatever world he was drawing. He had not heard me yet. I stood in the doorway and watched him for a moment before I let myself be known. That is how I have always seen him most clearly. In the unguarded seconds before he knows I am there. His mother died when he was 4. A car accident on a Tuesday. Ordinary day. Wrong intersection. Wrong moment. The great-aunt who took him afterward tried for 2 years before her body and her fixed income both gave out. It was not abandonment, it was limitation. But a child of 6 does not have the language for that distinction. What Cassius learned instead was to be small, undemanding, to read a room from the doorway before committing to it. The first time the caseworker brought him to our house, he stood in the living room entrance for a full minute. Just looked. Did not step in until he had assessed everything. The furniture, the light, the distance between things. I saw myself in that so completely I had to look away. I sat on the couch and let him take his time. I did not rush him, and I did not perform warmth, and I think that was the thing that finally made him step inside. Our bond did not arrive in one moment. It built in small ones. The morning he had a nightmare, and I sat on the floor of his room, not on the bed, not hovering, just present on the floor, until his breathing evened out. The afternoon, he waited 2 days to show me a failing grade because he expected punishment, and I took him for ice cream instead and told him we would fix it together. The first time he called me Mom, he said it so quietly I almost missed it. I pretended I had not heard so he would not feel watched. I walked to the kitchen and stood at the sink with my eyes closed for a long moment. Warwick never yelled at him. Never once. What he did was quieter and in some ways worse. He treated Cassius like furniture, present, occasionally inconvenient, not something you spoke to directly unless necessary. Surface questions about school, attendance at events when I insisted. From a distance, it looked like a reserved father. Cassius was not fooled for a single day. He cataloged every slight the way children catalog things they cannot yet name. Carefully, completely, without showing his hand. The day before the airport drop-off, Cassius had forgotten his tablet at home. I had dropped him to go back and get it while I ran a quick errand nearby. He moved through the house the way he always moved, quietly, not sneaking. Just the natural silence of a child who had learned not to take up unnecessary space. He heard voices from Warwick's study. The door was not fully closed, not Warwick's usual work voice. Lower, more deliberate. Cassius did not stop immediately. He slowed. Then he heard his name, not clearly, not in a full sentence, just enough to recognize it. His body reacted before his mind did. He stepped back, waited, listened. The words did not come in order. They came in pieces. Tomorrow night? Make sure. Nobody inside. A pause. Then his name again. Not attached to anything he could fully understand, but attached to something. Something wrong. Cassius did not try to understand it completely. Children like him do not need full sentences. They listen for tone, for danger, for what is not being said. His stomach tightened before the meaning formed. He moved without thinking. pulled the hallway closet door almost shut, and stepped inside just enough to disappear from the line of sight. He stayed there, still, listening. There was a moment, a brief one, where he heard movement closer to the door. A shift, a chair, something that made him hold his breath completely. Then footsteps, moving away. He did not come out immediately. He counted, not numbers, time. The way children count when they are afraid, by waiting longer than feels necessary. When he finally stepped out, the house felt the same. Quiet, normal, but it wasn't. He did not go back for the tablet. He walked outside and sat on the front step, very still, hands folded between his knees, thinking in the only way he knew how. Not about what it meant, but about what it felt like. Wrong. He stayed there for a long time, long enough for the feeling to settle into something he could carry. He decided to wait until Warwick was gone. Something in him, the same instinct that stood in doorways before entering rooms, understood that saying it too soon inside that house was dangerous. I finished my coffee and told him we should head home. He looked up from his notebook. Something moved across his face that was not quite fear and not quite relief. He closed the notebook carefully and stood without a word. I noticed. I was already reaching for my keys. The morning looked the way mornings do when nothing is supposed to go wrong. Blue sky, light traffic. Cassius had his window down slightly, and I could hear the wind moving through the gap. I was thinking about dinner, whether I had enough in the refrigerator or whether I needed to stop on the way back. Ordinary thoughts. The kind that fill your mind when you believe you are returning to an ordinary life. I took the turn toward our street out of habit. I never made it all the way in. The first thing I saw was the barricade. Not dramatic. Just a police cruiser angled across the entrance, lights still turning slowly, even though whatever urgency had brought them there had already passed. Behind it, further down, I could see the tops of emergency vehicles, red and white, cutting through the quiet of a Tuesday morning. There were people standing in small clusters on the sidewalk, not moving much, just watching. I slowed without thinking. My hands tightened on the wheel. From where I sat, I could not see the house directly. Only the street, the vehicles, the stillness that settles after something has already happened. Cassius leaned forward slightly in his seat. "Mom." He did not finish the sentence. I did not answer him. I eased the car forward just enough to see past the police cruiser. Not close, not enough to draw attention, just enough to confirm what my body had already understood before my mind caught up. There was smoke damage further down the block. Dark, wrong, permanent. I stopped breathing for a second. Something inside me, something older than thought, older than logic, tightened and held. Do not go closer. It was not fear. It was not panic. It was instruction. I reached for my phone. My fingers hovered over the screen. Emergency, call. The simplest, most obvious thing in the world. I pressed it. It rang once. And then I ended the call. Not because I did not need help, because something in me understood, with a clarity that arrived all at once, that whatever had happened on that street had been planned with the assumption that we were inside that house. If I stepped into that scene too quickly without understanding who knew what and when, I would be walking into something unfinished. I lowered the phone slowly. I pulled my foot off the brake. The car rolled back, quiet and controlled. Then I turned the wheel and drove past the street without stopping. No hesitation, no second look. In the rearview mirror, I could still see the flashing lights. Smaller now, distant, as if it belonged to someone else. Cassius turned in his seat to look back. I reached over and touched his arm gently. "Don't," He faced forward again immediately. We drove in silence for 2 streets, then 3. I turned a corner I did not need to turn, then another. I kept driving until the lights were gone completely and the street looked like any other street in any other part of the city. Only then did I pull over. The engine stayed running. I kept both hands on the wheel and stared straight ahead. I did not cry. My mind moved instead, fast, controlled, deliberate. Documents, clothes, his school bag, my work laptop, the photographs on the mantle. Then the list stopped. Because none of that was the point. The point was that we were supposed to be inside that house last night. I was supposed to be inside that house. Cassius was supposed to be inside that house. I closed my eyes for a brief second. They believed we were. I opened them again. Cassius had not moved. His hands were folded tightly in his lap, the way they had been in the car the day before when he told me what he heard. I turned my head and looked at him properly for the first time since we reached the street. "You told me the truth," I said quietly. "And I didn't listen. I'm sorry." He nodded once. No hesitation. No need for explanation. I turned the radio off. The silence was cleaner, easier to think inside. I did not call the police again from that street. Not because I wouldn't. Because I needed one controlled space before I said anything that could not be taken back. So I drove, straight to my mother's house. Sylvester was already outside when I pulled into the driveway. He had his phone in his hand, still on a call. He looked at my face once and ended it immediately. "A neighbor called," he said. "They're saying there was a fire on your street." I nodded. He stepped closer to the car window, lowering his voice instinctively. "It's already on the local news. They're calling it suspicious, not accidental. Fire marshals involved." I sat with that word. Suspicious. It meant someone had already seen what I had not needed to get close enough to confirm. It meant this was not a mistake. It meant something had been done. I turned the engine off. For a second, neither of us moved. Then I opened the door. We went inside. My mother took one look at my face and cleared the kitchen. No explanation, no questions at the door. She simply looked at me the way mothers look when they already know something is wrong and have been waiting for confirmation. And she turned to whoever was nearby and said, "Give us the room." Just the 2 of us at that table. A cup of tea she made that neither of us touched. I told her everything in order. Cassius's warning in the car. Staying the night. The drive back that morning. Turning toward our street out of habit. The police cruiser blocking the entrance. The emergency vehicles further down. The people standing in clusters watching something that had already happened. I told her I didn't get close. I told her I didn't need to. I told her what my body understood before my mind did, that something had been done to that house. What Sylvester had told me about the fire classification filled in the rest. My mother, Odessa Lattimore, is not a woman who interrupts. She is also not a woman who sits quietly through difficult things by nature. She has opinions, and she voices them, and she has never once in my life pretended otherwise. So the fact that she let me speak from beginning to end without a single word told me she understood exactly how much weight she was holding. When the wider family came in, the reactions arrived in layers. Sylvester reached for his phone immediately. "We need to report this properly," he said. "Everything. Now." My mother didn't look at him. "Finish listening first," she said quietly. He stopped. Lorette paced once across the room, then turned back. "We should go find him," she said. "If he's behind this." "We are not doing anything impulsive," my mother said. Not louder. Just final. My uncle went very quiet. The kind of quiet that is more frightening than any raised voice because it means someone has already moved past the emotion and into something else entirely. And then my cousin said what someone always says in moments like that. Are we sure? Maybe it was electrical. These things happen. The room shifted. Not dramatically, just enough to register that not everyone was standing in the same place yet. My mother did not respond to that. She kept her eyes on me. "Do you have your ID?" she asked. "Do you have access to money?" Not. "Are you all right?" Not. "I cannot believe this." Practical questions. The questions of a woman who has been quietly preparing for worst cases her entire life. I nodded. Yes. Sylvester stepped out of the room then, already dialing. Not the police directly. I could hear the difference in his voice. Controlled. Measured. He was calling someone who knew how to handle something like this properly. Then Lorette said, "I never trusted him. I stayed quiet because you loved him and I didn't want to be the reason you couldn't. I had survived the drive. I had driven away without braking." That sentence broke me. Not loudly. There was no loudness in it. Just very quiet, crying at a kitchen table while my family sat around me and nobody tried to rush me through it. Cassius was in the next room. Everyone knew he could hear. My uncle stood up without a word, went and sat beside him, and put on whatever Cassius wanted to watch. He didn't explain anything. He didn't ask questions. He just sat there. That was the most important thing anyone did that afternoon. By the time Sylvester came back in, his voice had settled into something firm. "I've got a lawyer," he said. "We're not making any statements yet. Not until we understand what's already been reported." That was how it started. The lawyer called within the hour. Direct. No wasted words. The house fire had already been logged as suspicious. A missing occupant report was being prepared. My name was going to enter that system within hours, if it hadn't already. "I need to know one thing," the lawyer said. "Are you safe right now?" "Yes." "Good. Then you stay exactly where you are and you do not contact law enforcement directly yet. I will make that contact for you." There was a pause. Then, "If your husband believes you were inside that house, we do not correct that assumption prematurely. We let the investigation move forward without interference." I understood immediately. This was no longer just survival. This was positioning. The lawyer contacted the detective assigned to the fire through proper channels that same evening. Not speculation. Not theory. Confirmation. I was alive. I was represented. I would present myself when advised. That one call did two things at once. It protected my family from any accusation of obstruction. And it kept Warwick completely in the dark. My phone had been at my mother's house since the morning of the airport drop-off. It stayed there, powered off. Sylvester got me a prepaid. By that night, my name was already online. I sat at the dining table and watched it happen in real time. House fire under investigation. One occupant unaccounted for. Then name, age, address. I read it without reacting. Missing. Not confirmed. Not yet. I noted the difference and kept reading. 4 days later, the doorbell rang. Sylvester opened it. Warwick was standing there in a pressed suit, eyes carrying the specific redness of a man who had been performing grief long enough that it was beginning to feel real to him. He had already spoken to police once. I could hear it in the way he answered Sylvester's first question. Measured. Careful. Nothing volunteered beyond what had already been said. Sylvester let him in. An active decision, not a passive one. Every word out of Warwick's mouth in that living room was evidence. He sat. He accepted water my mother brought without warmth. He did not notice. He spoke about what a wonderful woman I was. Past tense. My mother noticed immediately. He stayed 20 minutes. Embraced her at the door. told Sylvester to call if they needed anything. I was in the back bedroom the entire time. I heard his voice through the wall. Not the words, the tone, the performance of measured sorrow. I sat on the edge of the bed with my hands in my lap and listened to the man who tried to erase me, consoling my family 12 feet away. Cassius was in the back room with my uncle. The television volume was up. He never appeared. Warwick never knew he was there. After the door closed, nobody spoke for a moment. Then my uncle said quietly, "That man ironed his shirt before he came to tell us his wife was missing." Nobody laughed, but something in that room became permanent. Sylvester appeared in my doorway a few minutes later. He looked at me without speaking first. Then, "The detective working the fire called earlier," he said, "before Warwick showed up. They're already asking questions. They want to speak with anyone who had recent contact with you." I stood up slowly. "Good," I said. "That means they're already looking at him." The hardest part was not hiding. The hardest part was staying hidden when every instinct I had was pulling me toward a phone, toward a voice, toward anyone who knew me, a co-worker, a church friend, my neighbor across the street, just to say I am alive. And I need you to know that. That urge was constant. I learned to sit inside it without moving. My phone stayed powered off in a drawer at my mother's house. I retrieved it once, long enough to write down the numbers I needed. Then Sylvester locked it away again, and I did not ask for it back. Not because I couldn't use it, because I wasn't allowed to use it yet. That distinction mattered. The detective assigned to the fire knew I was alive within hours of my arrival at my mother's house. The lawyer made sure of that. My name had already entered the system as a missing occupant. Correcting that publicly would have changed the direction of the investigation too early, so the correction was made quietly. Off record, controlled. I was alive, I was safe, I was represented, and I was not to surface, not until the timing served the case. I could not call my workplace, could not reach my friends, could not explain to anyone in my life why I had simply ceased to exist. So I watched instead. I watched my own name take shape in real time through Sylvester's laptop. First, as a headline, "House fire under investigation. One occupant unaccounted for." Then, as a person, name, age, address. Then, as a story, a co-worker posted a photograph from a work event 3 years ago. A church mother wrote 3 paragraphs about my character that were so accurate they hurt to read. I read every word. I closed the laptop and went to sit with Cassius without saying anything about it. Later that evening, the local station aired footage, not close, not detailed, shot from the end of the block, the same distance I had seen it from that morning. Emergency vehicles, fire damage. The reporter speaking in that careful tone reserved for situations that are not yet fully understood. Suspicious origin. Investigation ongoing. One occupant believed to have been inside. I turned the volume down before they said my name. Cassius could not go back to school, could not contact his friends. He was 10 years old and had been stripped of every familiar thing, and he handled it the way he handled everything, with a composure that worried me more than tears ever could. I built routines to give our days a shape, a reading hour, a drawing hour, early morning walks before the neighborhood fully woke up. One morning on our walk, he asked me quietly if we were safe. I told him yes. He nodded and did not ask again. I understood that he was not entirely convinced. Neither was I. But we were both choosing to function inside the uncertainty rather than be swallowed by it. And that choice, made silently, together, every single day, was its own kind of strength. By the 3rd day, the calls had started reaching my mother's house, not directly for me, for her. people checking in, asking if she had heard anything, asking if there was any update, the kind of concern that moves quickly through communities when something feels wrong, but not yet confirmed. She answered carefully. "We're waiting on information." Nothing more. Nothing that could place me anywhere. Late at night, I replayed things. Not the house. I had not seen enough for that to anchor itself clearly. Conversations I had filed away. Moments I had dismissed. The small signs that made a different kind of sense now. I gave myself exactly enough time to see them clearly. And then I stopped. Not because the self-examination was wrong, but because every minute I spent looking backward was a minute I was not spending on what came next. I could not afford the past. Not yet. The private investigator Sylvester retained through the lawyer surfaced the insurance policy in the first week. He brought the documentation to the kitchen table without preamble. I looked at the date the policy was opened. 14 months before the fire. I sat with that number and counted backward. 14 months ago, I had been in the hardest push of the adoption process, paperwork, follow-up calls, the final home assessment. I had been fighting every single day to bring Cassius home. Warwick had been sitting across from me at dinner, at church, in our bed. And he had been quietly, carefully, taking out a policy on my life. He knew I could not carry a pregnancy. He agreed to the adoption because refusing would have exposed what he actually was. And then he began building a plan to remove me. Because the child I had fought for, the family I had built from nothing, did not fit the future he was already constructing somewhere else. He had taken the most private truth about my body and turned it into a lie he told another woman to make himself sympathetic. I put the document down on the table. I did not cry. Something in me rearranged itself quietly, shifted into a formation that did not have a name yet, but that I could feel the edges of. Sharp edges. The kind that do not move when you press against them. The lawyer sent one question through Sylvester that evening. Does she want justice, or does she want him destroyed? I did not need 10 seconds. Both, I said. In that order. The first thing she showed me was not the woman. It was the timeline. Sandra Gilchrist laid it out across my mother's dining table in a straight, deliberate line. Dates, movements, calls, filings. No emotion attached to any of it. Just structure, cause, and effect. A sequence that did not need interpretation because it explained itself. I had imagined it would feel like something from television. It did not. It felt like sitting across from a very calm woman while she reduced my marriage to a pattern I should have seen and did not. Sandra had been doing domestic investigations for 11 years, and it showed in the way she asked questions I had not thought to ask, and wrote down answers without reacting to a single thing emotionally. I found that both unsettling and reassuring. She was exactly what this required. Within the first week, she came back in layers. Warwick had returned from his business trip 2 days after the fire. He gave one brief statement to a local outlet, composed, measured, the words of a devastated husband. And then he went quiet. Not withdrawn. Controlled. He had not pushed aggressively for a death certificate, which the legal process would not grant quickly without confirmed remains anyway. But he had consulted an attorney about expedited proceedings to have me declared legally dead. Sandra had the documentation. He was not grieving. He was managing a timeline. She let that sit between us for a moment before moving on. 5 days in, she found the other woman. She lived in a city 3 hours away. She was visibly pregnant, approximately 6 months, which placed conception around 9 months before the fire. Consistent with a relationship that started around the same time, Warwick took out the insurance policy on my life. Sandra slid the photographs across the table without comment. Public places. Daylight. No attempt to hide. I looked at them for a long time. She was younger than me. She looked happy in the specific way a woman looks happy when she believes her life is moving in the right direction. I sat with what I felt, and it was not what I expected. It was not rage. It was clarity. This woman did not know. Whatever she believed about the man she was carrying a child for, she did not know what had been done to make space for her. That distinction mattered to me. I filed it and kept reading. The third finding came in a single page: phone records, repeated contact between Warwick and a number tracing to a man with a minor criminal record. The calls clustered tightly in the 2 weeks before the fire: short, frequent, purposeful. They stopped completely the day of. Not proof on its own, but not random either. A shape. A very deliberate shape. Sandra tapped the page once, not for emphasis, but to mark the transition. Then she closed the folder halfway. "There is one more thing," she said. "The contact, the man who connected your husband to the people who set the fire. We identified him." She said the name. I recognized it before she finished. Fenwick Darville, Deacon's nephew. Always had an encouraging word at Sunday service. Shook my hand at the door after worship more times than I could count. And the man who had slowed his car on our street that Tuesday morning while I was loading the trunk for the airport. He had lifted 2 fingers from the steering wheel. I had looked up, registered him as a neighbor passing by, and gone back to what I was doing. He was not passing by. He was confirming that Warwick was leaving, that the house was operating on schedule, that the plan could move forward. I had looked directly at him and seen nothing because I had no reason to see anything. He had been sitting in the same pews as me for years, close enough to watch everything, positioned perfectly to help take it all apart. I sat with that for a long moment. I did not speak. Sandra did not rush me. She opened the folder again only when I looked back up. "There is something else," she said. Her voice did not change. "About the 2 men who actually set the fire." A pause. "One of them has not slept properly since that night. He has been asking around quietly about whether there is any way to make something right without going to prison." She looked at me steadily. "He does not know you are alive, but his conscience has found a door, and it is slightly open." By the 6th week, I had stopped flinching when I saw my own name in the missing persons updates online. By the 8th week, I was sleeping properly again. By the 10th week, I understood something about myself that 8 years of marriage had buried so quietly I had forgotten it was there. I am exceptionally good at long-term thinking when the stakes are high enough. Warwick had benefited from that quality for years without knowing it existed. He was about to experience it differently. The transformation did not announce itself. It happened in specific moments. The morning I stopped crying in the shower and started making lists instead. The afternoon I sat with the lawyer for 3 hours, going through the evidence architecture, and realized I was asking sharper questions at the end of the meeting than at the beginning. The evening I told Lorette, who had been sitting with me most nights absorbing whatever needed to come out, that I did not need to talk about the marriage anymore, that I had finished grieving it. She looked at me carefully and said nothing. That silence was the most respectful thing anyone gave me in those 3 months. It was not a clean shift. There was one night, somewhere in the middle of the 2nd month, when I picked up the prepaid phone and dialed his number. I do not remember deciding to do it. My body moved before my thinking did. The call connected. It rang once, twice. I ended it before the 3rd. I sat there with the phone in my hand for a long time after that, not shaking, not crying, just very aware of how close I had come to undoing everything we were building. I did not pick the phone up like that again. The lawyer advised that Cassius's account needed to go through a formal forensic interview, conducted at a child advocacy center, recorded by trained professionals, entered as evidence rather than live courtroom testimony. It would protect him from cross-examination while preserving every word he heard in that hallway. I did not coach him. I sat with him on the back porch one evening and told him what the process would look like. He asked if the people in the room would be kind. I told him yes. He asked if it would be over quickly. I told him it would take exactly as long as he needed, and not 1 minute more. He nodded and opened his notebook and drew for the rest of the evening. I watched him and thought about what it costs a child to carry something that heavy for that long, and said nothing because some things are honored better in silence than in words. Sandra's weekly updates mapped Warwick's new life with a precision that told me he was not expecting any complications. He had relocated to the other city under the cover of a quiet, internal job transfer, joined a church within his first 2 weeks, established himself with the speed of a man who knows exactly which behaviors purchase trust in religious communities. He introduced the other woman as his partner. He was rebuilding the same architecture in a new city with a new person, and doing it with the patience of someone who believed the hard part was already behind him. He had not filed for a death certificate. The waiting period had not elapsed, but his lawyer was working on the expedited declaration process. He was managing time the way he managed everything else, carefully, from behind the appearance of a grieving man doing what grieving men do. Then Sandra told me about the church ceremony. Rings, vows, a full congregation, a pastor presiding. No legal documents signed. He understood the death certificate problem too well to create that exposure. He had simply performed a marriage in front of witnesses and let them believe what they were watching was real. Sandra slid a photograph across the table. Not posed. Taken from the side of the room. Warwick standing beside her, his hand resting lightly at the small of her back. Familiar. Practiced. I looked at it for a moment longer than I needed to. Then I turned it face down. That calculation, knowing exactly how to claim everything without signing anything, told me more about who Warwick Pickens actually was than anything else Sandra had documented. The cooperative witness took 4 days to respond to the indirect contact. He asked 2 questions. Was I alive? And was there a way through this that did not end his life completely? The lawyer began drafting a cooperation framework. Sandra called me that evening. He is willing to talk, she said, fully. When do you want to move forward? I did not hesitate. When we have everything, I said. Not before. I never met Ruford Holloway directly. I did not want to. What I learned about him came through Sandra, then through the lawyer, and finally through a formal written statement I read at the kitchen table alone. But I thought about him more than I expected to. This frightened man who had agreed to something he did not fully understand and had not slept properly in 3 months. There was no sympathy in that thinking. Just the cold utility of understanding exactly what he was and what he was worth to the case. He and Caswell Treadwell were reached through Fenwick Darville, who accessed them through a chain of 3 people loosely connected through the edges of church community networks. Not professionals, not careful. Just men close enough to the edges of the right circles to be useful, and far enough from consequence to believe they could step in and step out again without being seen. Ruford had staged a minor insurance incident years earlier, a small property job that never went to trial, and that history had attached itself to his name in certain circles. Fenwick found that name. Warwick's money found Fenwick. The offer that reached Ruford was larger than anything he had handled before. Large enough to quiet hesitation. Large enough to make something sound simple that was not simple at all. He believed, at the beginning, that it would be clean. A house. An empty house. fire damage, an insurance payout that did not belong to him but that would still reach him in part. Something distant, something impersonal, until the instruction changed. Sandra made a point of that when she walked me through the statement. There had been pushback. Not moral, practical. Ruford had asked twice through Fenwick whether the property was supposed to be occupied. He had been told no the first time. Then the answer shifted. Gradually, carefully. The instruction that came back the second time was more precise. Confirm the house is occupied. Proceed only when certain the occupants are inside. The payout is conditional on the insurance claim, and the claim requires confirmed casualties. Sandra didn't dramatize it when she read it aloud. She didn't need to. That shift, from property damage to confirmed presence, was the point where hesitation should have ended everything. It didn't, because by then, they were already in it. Money had already changed hands in part. Commitment had already been made. Walking away no longer felt simple. It felt dangerous. That is how men like Ruford get moved from one decision into another. Not in one step, in increments. Small enough to justify, large enough to trap. That single instruction, documented, repeated, confirmed through multiple statements, is what elevated the charge from arson to conspiracy to commit murder. 2 counts, one for me, one for Cassius. They arrived after midnight. The house was dark. The car was in the driveway. A light had been left on in the back of the house, dim, but visible from the angle they approached. They sat in their vehicle longer than they had planned to, watching, waiting. Ruford's statement described it in pieces. Caswell wanted to move quickly. Said the longer they sat, the more exposed they were. Ruford said they needed to confirm. Said that was the instruction. Caswell told him the car being there was confirmation enough. That people do not leave their car and disappear in the middle of the night. That the light meant someone was inside. That they were already taking too long. There was a point, a small one, buried in the middle of that statement, where Ruford described opening his door. Halfway, not fully stepping out, just enough to feel the air. He said he stood there for 3 seconds deciding whether to walk up to the house and check. 3 seconds. Then he closed the door. Not because he was certain, because uncertainty would have required him to stop. And stopping would have meant facing everything he had already agreed to. So they told each other what they needed to believe. That the house was occupied. That the family was asleep. That the instruction had been satisfied. They set the fire at 2 points on the ground floor. Fast, deliberate. Then they left. They drove away and spent the next 3 months waiting for news of bodies that never came. Understanding slowly, and then all at once, what that silence meant. I read through Ruford's full statement in measured sections. I was doing fine until I reached the part that confirmed Cassius's name had been in the original instruction. Not mentioned in passing. Specified. The boy was to be in the house. I put the document down. I did not pick it up again for 20 minutes. When I did, I was very calm. The lawyer was watching me, and I could see in her expression that she recognized what that calmness was. It was not peace. It was the specific stillness of someone who has moved entirely beyond the emotional register of a situation and into something that operates at a different temperature altogether. Caswell Treadwell was not cooperating. He was colder than Ruford, less driven by conscience and more by calculation, and his calculation had determined that silence served him better. The lawyer was unbothered. Ruford's full chain of command testimony, combined with the phone record pattern and the insurance timeline, was sufficient. Caswell's silence would cost him at sentencing. Fenwick Darville cooperated partially, enough to confirm his role and corroborate the chain back to Warwick. His attempt to frame himself as merely a middleman did not survive how specifically he had conveyed those instructions. The lawyer noted this without sentiment. All 4 components were in place. She told me we could move. I asked one question. When is his next confirmed church appearance? She looked at me for a moment longer than usual. I held her gaze. I want it done, I said, when the most people are watching. Sandra sent the photograph without warning. It came through on a Tuesday morning while I was at the kitchen table with my coffee. I opened it without thinking. And for a moment, I did not understand what I was looking at. Warwick stood at the front of a congregation in a well-fitted dark suit. His hand rested lightly on the shoulder of a woman holding a newborn. A pastor stood beside them, smiling broadly. The caption read, "Celebrating new life and God's grace." I looked at the photograph for a long time. The baby had been born 3 weeks earlier. A girl. The other woman, Vashti Beauford, Sandra had named her in the file, was looking down at the child with the specific exhausted tenderness of a new mother who has not slept properly in days and does not care. She looked like a woman who believed she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Warwick looked like a man who had never lost anything. There was no strain in his posture, no hesitation in the way he stood beside her, no trace of the life he had set on fire 3 months earlier. He had built it all quickly. The new church, where he tithed visibly and volunteered for outreach committees and remembered every name. The comfortable rental home. The ceremony. Rings, vows, a pastor presiding. No legal documents signed because he understood exactly why he could not sign them yet, but complete enough that everyone who attended believed they had witnessed a marriage. Sandra sent the recording an hour later. Audio from a small gathering in that same church. Not a sermon. A testimony. Warwick's voice. Calm. Measured. He told them his first marriage had been emotionally dead for years. That his wife had never wanted children. That she had turned away from him long before he had the courage to leave. He said it with a quiet sadness that invited sympathy. Then he said something else. Something that stayed with me longer than anything in that recording. He said, "Some people are not built for family, no matter how much you try to give them one." I stopped the audio, not because I could not listen, because I had heard enough. That story, built on the most private truth about my body, twisted into a lie about my character, was the thing that settled deepest. Not the betrayal, not the fire, the rewriting, the certainty with which he spoke it, the ease. I set the phone down carefully on the table. Sandra confirmed the church was planning a formal naming ceremony for the baby. Full congregation, families on both sides, community leaders, scheduled for a Sunday 3 weeks away. The kind of event where his entire constructed world would be assembled in one room. His reputation at its most visible and most celebrated. 3 weeks. I instructed my lawyer to have Vashti Beauford notified privately before any public action. A separate contact. At her home. Before the arrest. She would not find out standing in a congregation surrounded by people who were watching her face. She had not created this situation. And she would not be punished inside it. Sylvester thought I was being too generous. Lorette said nothing. That silence told me she understood. I told them both. I know what it feels like to be the woman in that house who doesn't have the full truth. I'm not doing that to her. The baby had done nothing. She had simply been born into a story she did not write. I thought about that longer than I expected to. I called Cassius into the room that evening. He came in with his notebook still in his hand. I waited until he sat down before I spoke. I told him calmly, in words a 10-year-old could hold, that it was almost time. That he had told the truth when it would have been easier to stay quiet. that the truth had done exactly what truth is supposed to do when someone is brave enough to speak it. He listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he asked one question. "Can we get a new house after?" I laughed. A real laugh. The first one in 3 months. It surprised both of us. "Yes," I said. "We can get a new house." I did not go. I had made that decision weeks ago and had not second-guessed it once. Not because I was afraid to face him. Not because I could not. But because I had spent 3 months becoming someone who did not need to stand in a room and watch a consequence land to feel the full weight of her own survival. I already knew what I had come through. I did not need to see his face to confirm it. I was at my mother's dining room table when it happened. Cassius was in the next room doing his reading hour. Odessa was in the kitchen. I could hear her moving, the quiet domestic sounds of a woman who expresses love through proximity and motion. I was sitting at the same table where I had first met with Sandra, where I had looked at photographs of Vashti Beauford holding her newborn, where I had read Ruford Holloway's statement and put it down for 20 minutes before I could pick it up again. I had a cup of coffee in front of me that I was not drinking. The arrest warrant had not been rushed. It had been built, every statement documented, every call pattern verified, every connection between Warwick, Fenwick, and the men who set the fire established cleanly enough to survive scrutiny in more than one jurisdiction. My lawyer had walked the other city's detectives through the entire case weeks earlier. They had taken their time with it, reviewed it independently, confirmed what needed confirming. When the warrant was finally signed, it wasn't timing, it was readiness. Execution belonged to them, not to me. She had one contact on the team who agreed to send word when it was done. I checked the clock at 10:14, at 10:31, at 10:47. I drank half the coffee. I heard Cassius turn a page in the next room. I thought about the airport departure entrance 5 months ago, his hand on my forehead. The same duration as always, not longer. I had been thinking about dinner on the drive back. I had been thinking about dinner while he was already counting down to the night everything was supposed to end. 3 hours away, the naming ceremony had just concluded. The congregation was still warm with it, children moving between adult legs, cups of coffee, the particular ease of people who believe they are gathered in celebration. Warwick was there in his suit, his new life arranged carefully around him, every piece of it in place. Law enforcement had confirmed his presence earlier that morning. That was all they needed. The officers entered during the fellowship period, not to create a scene, because that was where he was. They approached him calmly, identified themselves, asked him to step outside. He went without resistance. In front of that congregation, the people who had embraced him, who had witnessed his vows, who had celebrated that baby's name that morning, he performed composure until the last possible moment. Controlled, contained, dignified. It was the last image they would ever have of him as a free man. Outside, away from the room, the charges were read. At the same time, across that city, a contact my lawyer had arranged knocked on Vashti Beauford's door. That part had been deliberate. She was home with the baby. She opened the door and received information that took apart everything she understood about her life. I was not there for that. I only knew it happened because my lawyer confirmed it did. I had made sure she would not find out standing in a room full of people watching her face. That was the only thing I could give her, and I gave it. My prepaid phone lit up on the table. 3 words from my lawyer. It is done. I read it, set the phone face down, put both hands flat on the table, and breathed, slowly, completely. The way you breathe when something that has been sitting on your chest for 3 months finally lifts. Not triumph. Something quieter than that. the specific relief of a weight being set down after so long that you had forgotten what it felt like to stand without it. Cassius appeared in the doorway. He had heard me exhale. He crossed the room, without a word, and sat down beside me at the table. Neither of us spoke for a long time. Outside the window, it was an ordinary Sunday morning. We were both still here. I watched it the way you watch a controlled demolition, knowing exactly what is coming, understanding every mechanic of it, and still being quietly surprised by how completely a structure collapses once the right supports are removed. The charges were filed as public documents. Arson, conspiracy to commit murder, 2 counts, 1 bearing my name, 1 bearing Cassius's. Insurance fraud. They surfaced simultaneously in both communities that knew Warwick Pickens, and the effect in each was immediate and irreversible. His original church moved through it in stages. First came disbelief, the particular disbelief reserved for a man who had led prayer groups, organized outreach, shaken every hand, and remembered every name. Then came recognition. Not all at once, in pieces. Sandra sent me a short video taken on someone's phone during a midweek service. The pastor stood at the front of the room holding printed pages in his hand. The charges. His voice was steady, but the room was not. People shifting in their seats. A woman in the second row shaking her head slowly before the pastor finished reading. One man stood up halfway through, then sat back down again as if he had forgotten why he stood in the first place. Nobody spoke over him, but nobody looked settled either. The small things people had filed away began to reassemble themselves in real time. The way Warwick had spoken about me in the weeks after the fire. Past tense, composed, not quite like a man searching for a missing wife. The speed with which he had relocated. The adopted child he had never once mentioned with warmth in 8 years of public life. The pieces had always been there. Nobody had assembled them because nobody had reason to. Fenwick Darville's arrest landed the hardest. He was not a stranger in that community. He was known, trusted, present at the same services, the same fellowship dinners, the same outreach events. His arrest required that congregation to reckon with something deeply uncomfortable. The rot had not come from outside. It had been sitting in the pews beside them. In the new city, the naming ceremony photographs disappeared from the church's social media within hours of the arrest. Sandra showed me the page before and after. One moment, celebration. The next, absence. The pastor who had presided over the ceremony was publicly embarrassed and privately furious. He had been used as a prop in a performance, and his congregation had been the unwilling audience. Every piece of social capital Warwick had accumulated in 3 months dissolved at the same speed it had been built. That speed told its own story. His family did not close ranks. They fractured. His father, a deacon who had built his faith on the belief that righteousness was visible, that a good man presented as a good man, had no framework for what his son had done. The grief and the shame arrived at the same time, and he did not have language for either. His mother went silent, in the way people go silent when the pain is too structural to process with tears. His siblings split. One distanced immediately. Self-preservation, community standing, an unwillingness to absorb consequences for choices they had no part in. One initially defended him, not from belief in his innocence, but from the inability to dismantle everything they understood about the household they had grown up in. That fracture, playing out publicly in a community where everyone knew everyone, was its own form of justice that Warwick had never calculated. Ruford Holloway's cooperation earned him reduced charges. He would not escape consequence, but he would face a fraction of what Caswell Treadwell faced. Caswell's silence cost him everything at sentencing. Fenwick Darville's partial cooperation did not adequately account for the specificity of what he had conveyed, and his lawyer spent months attempting reductions, without meaningful success. Vashti Beauford cooperated fully. She had known nothing. The law treated her accordingly. She moved back to her original city with her daughter, and her family closed around her. I gave no interviews, no statements, no appearances. My lawyer spoke when absolutely necessary and said very little. The story was being told entirely by the evidence, and that was exactly how I had built it. I had nothing to perform. The documents performed for me. I was not watching his world collapse for satisfaction. I was watching to make sure every part of the structure came down completely, so that nothing could be quietly rebuilt later without the full weight of the truth underneath it. My lawyer called on a Thursday afternoon. Warwick had requested, through his attorney, that I agree to speak with him before the trial. I listened to the full request without interrupting. Then I said, no. Just that. No. And hung up. 3 different people told me I did not have to testify. My lawyer, Sylvester. Odessa, who said it quietly once and did not repeat it because she knew me well enough to know that once was enough to register, and more than once would be an argument. They all said the same thing in different words. The evidence was sufficient. The case was built. I did not have to put myself through it. I testified anyway, not for the case, for myself. I was not dramatic on the stand. I was precise. The prosecutor walked me through the timeline from the beginning. The airport drop-off, Cassius's warning in the car, the night at my mother's house, the drive back the next morning, parking at the far corner out of habit, turning on foot and seeing what was left. I answered each question completely and did not add a single word that was not asked for. I did not look at Warwick while I spoke. I fixed my gaze on the prosecutor or on a point just above the jury, and I stayed there. He was 15 feet away from me for the first time in 5 months. I gave him nothing. The defense attorney tried during cross-examination. He noted my eye contact, suggested it indicated uncertainty, and asked whether I was certain of my account. I turned and looked directly at him, not at Warwick, at the attorney, and said one word. Yes. It landed in that courtroom without elaboration and without apology. He moved on. The only moment I broke form was when the prosecutor asked me to describe the moment I understood that Cassius had been specifically included as a target. I paused. One pause in the entirety of my testimony, not from grief, not from weakness, but because some truths require a full breath before they can be spoken correctly. Then I answered and continued. Several jurors would later describe that pause as the moment the case became real to them. I did not know that at the time. I was simply telling the truth at the speed it required. Cassius did not testify live. His forensic interview, recorded months earlier at the Child Advocacy Center, was entered into evidence and played on a screen for the courtroom. I had seen it already. I did not watch the screen. I watched the jury watching it. I watched their faces change. He spoke in the voice of a 10-year-old who had learned early that truth was the only currency that never lost its value. He did not exaggerate. He did not perform. He simply told what he heard in that hallway. The words, the register of the voice, the moment his body understood danger before his mind did. The courtroom was very quiet the entire time. When it ended, nobody moved immediately. The defense built its argument around the chain between Warwick and the men who set the fire. It was the only available argument, and the attorney made it professionally. But Ruford Holloway's testimony, the phone record pattern, the insurance timeline, Fenwick Darville's corroboration, and the specificity of that original instruction, confirm occupancy, the boy is to be inside, together formed a picture that reasonable doubt could not survive. The jury listened. The jury decided. Guilty on all primary charges. Warwick received the verdict the way he received everything in public. Controlled, contained, composure held until the very last moment. I watched them lead him out and felt something I had not anticipated. Not satisfaction. Something quieter. The closing of a door that had been standing open for years, letting in cold air. The draft was gone. I could be warm now. My family was outside on the courthouse steps. Cassius was not. I had been firm about that. He was home with my uncle watching whatever he wanted. Odessa took my arm without saying a word, and we walked to the car. She waited until we were inside. So what do you want to do now? I looked out the window at the ordinary street and realized I had not built a single thought past this moment. I had been so focused on reaching it that there was nothing behind it yet. I want to go home, I said. She squeezed my hand. Then let's go build you one. He went back to school 4 months after the verdict. New school, new city, new teacher, who knew nothing about what he had carried for the past year and treated him like any other child walking through her door. That anonymity was exactly what he needed, and I had chosen that school partly because of it. Because sometimes the most healing thing in the world is a room full of people who have no idea who you are. I drove him the first morning, watched him walk through the front entrance with his backpack and his notebook tucked under his arm and disappear into the building without looking back. I sat in that car park for 11 minutes before I could make myself pull away. I counted them. 11 minutes of sitting there with my hands in my lap, making sure I actually believed he was safe inside before I could convince my body to leave. He did not talk about the fire directly. He did not talk about the trial or the hallway or any of it in a straight line. He processed sideways, the way he had always processed things, quietly and at an angle. Questions that arrived without warning at the dinner table about topics that seemed unconnected, but never were. I learned to answer them directly without making him feel observed. It was a skill that took me longer to develop than I expected, and I valued it more than almost anything else I had learned in my adult life. One evening, we were washing dishes, and he asked, without preamble, without looking up from the plate he was drying, whether I was ever angry at him for not telling me sooner. I turned off the water. I turned to look at him, and I told him the truth without softening it or expanding it, that what he had done was the bravest thing I had ever witnessed in my life, that the only thing I felt was grateful. He nodded, went back to drying the plate. Then, after a moment, I was scared he would do something right then if I said it too early. I know, I said. You were right to wait. He nodded once more, that was all. But something in him settled in a way I could see clearly, a tension he had been holding since that hallway finally releasing. And I did not say anything about it because some things are more real when they are not narrated. The civil case settled before the year was out. The financial outcome was not a fortune, but it was enough. Enough to purchase a home in the city where my family was. Enough to repay Sylvester properly for everything he had carried during those 3 months. He told me it was not necessary. I told him it was necessary to me. He accepted that. My lawyer confirmed explicitly what I already knew. The adoption had never been legally challenged. Cassius was my son, fully and completely. Nothing in the criminal proceedings touching that fact. When I told him, he said, I know, with a confidence I had not heard in his voice before. Not a child hoping something was true. A child who had decided it was and committed to that decision entirely. I noticed the difference and said nothing. I let it be true out loud between us. We moved into the new house on a Friday. By the following Saturday morning, it already felt like ours. I had coffee. He had his notebook. The television was on in the background, something neither of us was really watching. Nobody was talking. Just two people in a room that belonged to them, in a life that had been fought for and won. I looked at him across that room and thought about a boy standing in a hallway with his hand on a closet door, holding the most important information of our lives, waiting for the right moment to speak it. He looked up from his notebook. Mom, I want to learn to cook. I looked at him over my coffee. What do you want to learn first? He thought about it with complete seriousness. Something hard, he said. I smiled. All right then. Something hard. People ask me sometimes how I survived it. Usually women who have heard pieces of the story through the community, enough to know something terrible happened, not enough to know all of what it cost. They ask with genuine care, and I always pause before answering because the honest answer is more complicated than what they are looking for. They want me to say faith, family, strength. Those things are true. But the most honest answer is this. I survived it because a 10-year-old boy who had already lost too much in his short life decided he was not going to lose anything else. Everything that came after started with him standing in a hallway. I returned to hospital administration in the new city. My documentation had been fully restored through the legal process following the arrest. Professional standing, identification, everything. Different hospital. Same skill set. Colleagues who knew nothing about what had happened unless I chose to tell them. The work gave me structure, and I valued that genuinely now in a way I had only used it before. There is a difference between needing routine and appreciating it. I had crossed from one side of that line to the other. My family became something it had never quite been before. Not because the love was new, but because the crisis had burned away the polite distances families maintain to keep things comfortable. What was left was the actual thing. Lorette and I talked most evenings. Sylvester and I had developed a running argument about whose jollof was better that neither of us had any intention of resolving. My mother, Odessa, had a key to my house and used it whenever she felt like it. And I had stopped pretending that was anything other than exactly what I wanted. Vashti Beaufort and I never met. We probably never would. I knew through indirect channels that she was doing reasonably well. Back in her original city, her family around her, raising her daughter. I did not wish her harm. I did not wish her well in any active way. I simply did not include her in the emotional inventory of what was done to me. She was not a villain in this story. The villain was in prison. Those were two different facts, and I kept them separate. I did not trust quickly. I did not think I ever had. But now I understood why, and that understanding felt like information rather than damage. I was not closed. I was careful. I knew the difference between those two things in a way I had not known before, and I intended to keep knowing it. I had tried to blame myself for the marriage. 6 weeks into hiding, I had attempted that particular exercise, and then I put it down because it was neither accurate nor useful. I had read a man who had spent his entire adult life practicing how to be misread. I was not foolish. I was targeted. Those are different things, and I would not collapse them into each other to give the pain a shape that felt more manageable. Cassius turned 11 3 months after we moved in. He had friends at the new school. He cooked with me on Sunday evenings. We attempted things that were too ambitious and laughed when they failed and ate them anyway. He still had his notebook. One evening, I asked if I could see what he had been drawing lately. He considered it. The considering itself was new, that he weighed the question rather than hiding the notebook immediately, and then handed it over. I turned through the pages. Houses, page after page of different houses, different shapes, different sizes, different details in the windows and the doors. I looked up at him. He shrugged slightly. Just thinking about what home looks like. I closed the notebook and handed it back. I looked at this child who had whispered a truth I almost did not hear, who had stood in a hallway and held the most important information of our lives in his small, careful hands and waited, alone, afraid, 10 years old, for exactly the right moment. I thought about what home looks like. I looked around the room we were sitting in. I already knew.